So a very warm welcome to everyone. Someone will know that started doing online as opposed to in-person hard lockdown last year, and I like to look at things that are very hard to do on a tour. So we did a lot on brutalism, and then it was the time of Black Lives Matter, so it was great to have Dr. Berger in the US talking about what's happening there. And if you want to look at some of those, feel free to go to the YouTube channel. Kevin, I can understand why you have won many awards and been at Cambridge University and in the States to tackle this subject. And I'm thrilled this is your inaugural delivery of this new lecture. So Kevin, as many of you will know, he works at UCT. He convenes the third year, and I'm conscious Winnie, his wife, pictured here, was a fantastic member of the Zico South African National Gallery on the council. So some of you will know Winnie, and indeed would have heard Kevin give a lecture there. Kevin, as well as teaching, is just finishing off his doctorate. So good luck with that, Kevin. He was at Wits and then MIT, and given the subject culture, I was not surprised to see you won a prize for your interdisciplinary research. I think it's very exciting the way you're a practicing architect as well, not in your lovely home, pictured here, but your parents' home in Simonstown. You see the plan here, and then this bottom image, Vancouver, and I can't wait to hear more about the First Nation Canadian links later. But Kevin's worked, it seems like, all around the world, London and Joburg, and you can probably guess that's Simonstown. But if you want to see more of Kevin's work, you pop onto his site.
Okay, let me start with the first image and what got me thinking about the idea of culture, which was an interview with the leader of Boko Haram in Nigeria, where a journalist asked him why it was okay to use cell phones and modern weapons, whereas it wasn't okay to have Western books in a library when both were a product of Western culture. And his answer was, no, guns and cell phones are part of technology. They're not part of culture. Now, the irony is that the entire program in universities of cultural studies has been one to understand the cultural aspects of everything, that science in particular and technology are subcultures within a broader cultural framework, and that ironically everything we do is culture. Even the way we look at nature is through culture. That culture is such an all-enveloping aspect of our reality that it's actually impossible to step outside of your culture. So then I started to think about who else, a couple of things of what people think about culture. One accredited to Hermann Goering was, when I hear the word culture, I reach for my revolver. Cyril Connolly, the English writer and wit, said, when I hear the word gun, I reach for my culture. Here's a picture that's on the cover of a book, which I've had since 1985. When I hear the word culture, I take out my checkbook. And all of those are using culture to mean something very different. One is a right-wing conservative, one is a left-wing culture worker, one is an artist pointing out the commodification of culture. I'm a nerd, so when I hear the word culture, I reach for my dictionary. And there's a little picture of a brain inside a culture, inside the world, and an astronaut crossed out because, as it turns out, we can't be that astronaut outside of culture, but I'm giving it a go. One liner below that, It doesn't matter if something is real or not. If people believe it's real, it has real consequences. And that's kind of a starting point of thinking about culture for me, that much of culture is customary and mythological, but it absolutely conditions people's actions and therefore has real results. So in some real way, culture is real despite its mythical nature. So that's enough of the prologue. Culture connects and culture divides, or culture connect. Now, that's the idea, the key idea, I guess, I'm going to develop through the talk, that culture works two ways. Culture works to bring people together, and culture works to divide people apart. It brings people into an in-group, and in doing so, it creates an other, and that the other is often othered, which is, if you like, those who aren't in our culture are in some ways diminished to justify our culture as being the culture. So here's a picture on the left posted by Kate on the weekend, and that's, I believe it's Kate in a delightful sun hat, brying mussels on the beach. And there's a photo, a painting made by General Gordon, who was the chief of the Dutch troops in the Cape. He was a Scot, and when the British invaded the Cape, he deserted. He returned, if you like, to his culture. He couldn't see himself fighting Brits against Dutch people. But it's an image of Khoisan people enjoying a mussel braai on the beach. Now, there's no inherent difference between us and people from the past in terms of our mental capacity, but our cultures have enabled us to produce very much more sophisticated and complex objects. But culture is all about context. So the iPhone, which I used to make much of this lecture, and a stone tool. Well, they're both tools. They're both a product of culture. They're both a product of people who are equally intelligent, but have had, if you like, are connected to a smaller network. So context is everything in culture. A cell phone without its network is ultimately just a less good stone. And culture is the thing that enables us to think together, think with other people, and communicate and produce complexity well beyond the capacity of any individual. And just thinking through what kind of anthropologists, how they define culture, not sculpture, the nature and scale of that network. An individual person has a psyche, has a brain, which in itself is some ways a culture. We're not unitary individuals. We have internal debates with ourselves. A family is a small group where you can more or less reach agreement, either through yelling or discussion. But the institution is small enough that the cultural rules are completely implicit and completely understood or made up as they go along. A band is a group of families, and at that point, culture starts to become more complex because one needs a set of agreements about how you do things in order to carry out a particular way of life. You have a set of rules that enable you to live in society. And that's one of the definitions of culture, that it's those rules that enable a person to participate in society. Anthropologists think of culture emerging at the scale of the tribe. A tribe is, if you like, a group of bands. And a tribe is, if you like, a group of people who live in a village. Civilization it's all there in the name. It's simply a culture which has expanded to encompass the city-state. So civitas It's a set of rules which can govern, or which can be understood and can give order to an organization of the size of a city-state. So if we think of, history, architectural history, art history, the Renaissance was a series of city-states, and each of those had a slightly distinct culture, with a slightly distinct way of doing something. They wouldn't have called it culture, they would have called it civitas. The cities, the nation states arises at generally a later stage in most histories. So nations arise and they evaporate, but their description of culture is a nationality. It's a shared set of ideas which often are defined by a linguistic group with that as a commonality, as a way of discussing things. At a higher level of complexity, you have unions of states. So South Africa is an example of that. We arose out of the Union of South Africa, which was a series of 4 or 5 separate states. And the interesting thing is we don't share one language and we don't share one culture. The United States is also a union of separate states where people share a language, but there are distinct differences in culture. And say the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, where people shared a language, but there were also differentiated languages and extremely different cultures and religions. Next step up is, if you like, a global union, something like the United Nations, where there is crosstalk between nations, but nobody has actually yet managed to work out a way of governing the whole world. And at some level you can't, because you're not outside of it. You can't conceive of it as an entity separate to yourself. As complexity increases, or as the scale of a society increases, complexity increases, the ability to get things done increases, so power increases, creativity increases. The city is ultimately just a machine for bringing people together to enable them to discuss and be more creative. What doesn't change is that across societies of any scale and complexity, human beings are and have for the last 100,000 years been equally intelligent. We haven't mentally evolved, and people in a complex society are no more intelligent than people in a small society. The society itself thinks for us in ways that we can't think. The one thing that decreases as a society, an organization, a culture gets bigger is our ability to identify with it. We identify very strongly with ourselves, pretty strongly with our fellow family members. But witness the UK, we don't identify very strongly with people who live 20 miles away from us in what's called another country. So why, when we think about culture, do we think about the past? One of the books that got me interested in cultural studies was this book by the British traveler, Bruce Chatwin, which describes the songlines, the way in which Aboriginal people bear their culture through the learning of songs, which narrate mythical journeys through a landscape and ultimately provide both maps of that landscape and maps of the way one is supposed to act in that landscape, and maps of how it is that you're supposed to interact with people from other tribes and other cultures when you meet them. And at one level, it's easier to understand a culture that is not the one you're in, because you are slightly the astronaut in the first picture. You're at a distance. Let me just key this up. Now, one of the things about culture is everybody has one, but not everybody, nobody is allowed to make fun of the culture that is not their own. and one is even frowned upon in many ways for finding one's own culture strange and eccentric. Now, these are people in the year 2018, Morris dancing in the UK on May Day, nominally the first day of spring. They're tired, happy, and jangling. They've been carrying out what they see to be an extremely traditional English activity, the Morris dance. But it turns out that where does the word Morris come from? Well, it comes from Old English, Morisque, which means Moorish. And the Morris dance became fashionable in the 15th century in Europe as an exotic performance of how Europeans believed people in Africa danced. So that most English and eccentric of activities, which is entirely benign at some level, turns out to be an act of cultural appropriation and also of non-British origin. But it will be vigorously defended by English nationalists as part and parcel of their culture. But it's come, as everything else does, from somewhere else. On the left, a Morris dancer's legs. They tend to wear school shoes and promenade through towns, bells on the legs. On the right, a pair of Nike trainers by, and the name Brian Youngen. Brian Youngen is a native or First Nations artist in west coast of Canada, and has taken those Nike shoes, an object of globalized culture, and cut and sliced and arrayed them into this fantastic panel, which reflects upon the traditional art of the First Nations people, of the Haida people, of which he is a member. On the left, a totem pole made out of golf bags. The island on which he lives is a golfing paradise. And here's a person dealing with the fact that they belong to one culture, and they also belong to another culture, and they operate in both of those cultures. And he's trying to find an equivalence or a way in which one identity relates to another identity, which kind of plays with both of them and loosens up the strictures of the seriousness or the earnestness or the conservatism that's inherent in most cultures. And there's what he's referencing. The totem poles of the Pacific Northwest, the carved cedar panels of totemic animals. The one in the middle is a traditional one. The one on the right is the work of another contemporary artist, as are all of these. And this is an entire genre which is seen as authentic First Nations art. But ultimately, every single one of these is by a different person. But they all ascribe to an incredibly conservative and consistent view of what it is to make art as a First Nations person. Now, flip back to Brian Youngen. Brian Youngen is equally authentic, or maybe he's more authentic because he acknowledges that the world has moved on, that he both admires his culture and likes his trainers, because the world is a complex place in which many cultures overlap one another simultaneously. Now, talking about cultural appropriation, this comes from a guide on how to make Haida shapes and how to prepare a Haida panel for people who are crafters so they can learn it at home. And it's about how one makes something which is authentically of another time and another culture, if of the same place. And the art is reduced to a series of signs, a series of shapes, which you can array into patterns that please you. But they're ultimately robbed of their content. Now, the guy's carving a block of cedar. And cedar is absolutely central to the culture of that place. Cedar trees grow to vast heights, and from them can be made almost anything. Now, it was an incredibly prosperous and sophisticated society, and we have to remember that it's also a Stone Age society. These people didn't have metal tools until after colonialism. They used stone mallets and stone chisels to split wood. They also didn't have pottery, so the way they would cook would be to heat stones in a fire and drop them into a cedar box made so beautifully as to be waterproof, and in that way steam or boil their food. So sophistication and things that we think of as part of the ladder of sophistication or civilization don't all come together in any one place. The context determines that certain things happen. There's the context of the Haida people. This is Haida Gwaii, used to be known as Queen Charlotte Island. What does it have? It has the sea, it has stone, and it has cedar trees. Now, on the right, also a page from the same book on cedars. The fishing practices, how one uses cedar and stone in order to catch fish from rivers and sea. And this is what gave that society its prosperity, a predictable food supply, intensely gathered over the summer period, leaving long, cold, rainy winters to stay indoors and tell stories and make art. On the left is a page from a Canadian cultural studies textbook for primary school children. And it arrays essentially the totemic characters of the First Nations mythology. The top figure is the raven, the crow, the thunderbird who brings rain, the whale who commands the sea, the wolf who is loyal, becomes a dog, is both loyal and dangerous, the bear who looks after her children and will die for her children, symbol of motherhood and teaching and education wisdom, and the salmon, the provider has an instinct to return to its home, is always there and is ultimately the source of all good things. Now, long before ever going to Canada, I came across Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist, and he did a lot of his work in the Pacific Northwest. Two fantastic books, Totemism and The Raw and the Cooked. And at the bottom left, if any of you are my age, an album from 1983, Fine Young Cannibals, The Raw and the Cooked. Things find their way from high culture to popular culture. At the bottom, Totem and Taboo, a book by Sigmund Freud, which talks about the way that not just the Haida people, but all societies, all cultures, have at their center a series of myths which offer totems, which are positive symbols of how one should live one's life, and taboos, which are the things one mustn't do. And in Freud defines, if you like, the coming to the super ego, the developing of a conscience, as the internalization of societal taboos. And on the other hand, totemism, religion, as the idea of an exalted father, somebody who looks after you from a higher plane, and that all human thinking about our relationship to the world and to other people is centered around our thinking about things we understand, which is to say all mythology, all religion is a mythical structure, and at that level operates through metaphor. But it's the idea of the kind of metaphor that we're supposed to believe to be true, as opposed to it merely being a figure of speech. And the line I remember from The Raw and the Cooked is, animals are good to think with, or animals are not just good to eat, they're good to think with. Because in a world where animals are intimately part of your reality, the stories about them enable one to learn the stories, remember the stories, and internalize the ethos of the mythology in a way that is approachable by children and stays with you for your life. There's a canoe in the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver. The canoe has on it a bear, that's the bigger face, and the bear is chasing a salmon. So when you paddle your canoe through the ocean, the bear is always chasing the salmon and never quite catching up. And the presence of those animals, if you like, will hopefully, in one's mind or in one's relationship to the natural world, enable one to have a successful hunt. There's another Haida object which has on it the face of a bear, and that's the club. And it's the club with which, when you've caught the salmon, you kill the salmon. So the bear helps you to hunt the food, and it helps you to kill the food. The club is also a weapon of war. So the Haida people in particular, amongst the First Nations of the Pacific Northwest, were known as the Vikings of the Pacific Northwest. They were a warlike people who had the biggest canoes and were renowned for their raiding of other peoples, their theft of other people's belongings, and their enslavement of those people. So to us, these cultures appear almost indistinguishable, but to people within those cultures, the distinctions were real and a matter of life and death. And if one was in the us, one was right, and if one was in the them, one was fair game. So despite the sophistication, civilization, deep artistic traditions of a society like that, just as in a society like ours, there's a set of rules about who it's okay to kill, who it's okay to go to war with, and who is outside of our group. These two little images describe it really rather well. Our great religion, their primitive superstition, and the reverse thereof. Now, in reality, somehow, I'm more of the sentiment of the line I typed in below, that our blessed and barbarous homeland is home to our blessed and barbarous leader, and that all of us, in all of our cultures, have a series of things which are repugnant to people from other cultures and taken as normal to us. But in giving us the ability to live together as an in-group, our culture also, as I said earlier, outs or others, those who are not part of that in-group. And so it is that culture is both the thing that brings us together, it connects us, and it's the thing that divides us. One architectural image on the left, the inner hall of the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver, and on the right, a view of a reconstructed Haida dwelling looking back towards the museum, where the architect Arthur Erickson in the 1970s was called upon to make a museum to house the artifacts that were being collected because people had effectively abandoned the villages and the artifacts were rotting away. And a couple raised the money for the museum and the accumulation of and protection of these objects. And Erickson did a very interesting thing. He paid homage to the culture whose objects he was housing, but he didn't try to imitate it. He made a large contemporary modern building that talks to that culture as an equal. It says, this is how we do it now, and that's how you did it then. This is what I've learned from you. There's no aping. There's a discourse. And so it was with the development of that collection. It's an absolutely extraordinary building and museum. Within it is this fantastic sculpture by Bill Reed. Sorry, I forgot his name. I had to consult Winnie, our Canadian expert. And this is Raven sitting on the clamshell out of which humanity is being born. And it sits under a skylight. It's a sculpture in the round. And what's interesting is in the Northwest culture, it's the raven who is the creator. And the raven is the trickster. The raven is the crow. It's the bird that chases away the eagle. It's the one that steals the shiny things. It's the one who's both friend and enemy, the one who is unpredictable, the one who is both good and evil. Now, that's an interesting idea because on the left is Loki from a medieval document, and on the right is Loki from an ad for the yet to arrive TV show, where he's been extracted from the Avengers as a particular character. And why? Because there's this incredible appeal of the character who is, you don't know, are they good? Are they evil? Are they both? Are they one? Are they the other? And that's an idea which interestingly transcends many cultures. That's Shiva, the creator and destroyer. And on the right, the person I actually quoted right at the beginning, Robert Oppenheimer, the pacifist and intellectual, the program for the making of the atom bomb, who, when the bomb went off, the line that came to his mind, the destroyer of worlds, becomes Shiva. On the opposite side of that field of play, if you like, whilst I was putting together the talk, the news appeared of 215 children's remains being found buried in under the sports fields of a boarding school under the fields of a boarding school, where the Canadian government had forced children to leave their families and be enculturated into, if you like, Canadian culture through a boarding school system which was run largely by the church and was heartless and soulless and destructive to a fault. So we think of Canada as a wonderful and liberal place, which it is, but in the very recent past, there was the idea that the only way to deal with cultural difference was to replace the culture of the minority with the culture of the majority, and that this would somehow get rid of the field of contestation within people and between people. Two books worth reading. One, The Idea of Culture by Terry Eagleton, and the other, The Invention of Culture by Roy Wagner. One summarizes, if you like, the idea of culture as the most complex word outside of nature. and the culture, ironically, is the thing which defines itself against nature. Roy Wagner's book looks at culture from a different way. Wagner was an anthropologist who, in going to study a different culture, understood that what he was actually doing was inventing that culture by describing it, because people in a culture are of that culture. They don't see it as a thing, it is their reality. And from that, he was able to explain or understand that culture is a thing that we make, and we make it by looking at the context in which we are and reconfiguring the facts of life, the kind of practices of existence. And so it is that culture is a thing which potentially is constantly reinvented by the individual and the group. Or on the other hand, culture is a thing imposed by the power structure who is at the pinnacle of the insider group, the priests, the shaman, the chiefs. So the other thing about the Haida society is that it's absolutely hierarchically defined. One was born into a social position, one died in that social position. There weren't social classes because every individual within the society was ranked from the chief to the slave. And the potlatch, the festivals in which gifts were given to other tribes, other groups to construct social bonds, one received belongings or gifts directly in proportion to one's social status. So the slave got nothing. The lowest of the in-group got almost nothing. The chief got vast wealth bestowed on him, which ironically is something a lot like our modern culture industry, if you like. Nobody gets more free stuff than the rich and famous, as it happens. As I said, I looked at my dictionary. Where does the word culture come from? Culture, agriculture, cultivation, cultured, cult, and the occult all share the same root. And that root is the word cool, which comes from Sanskrit and into India, into Italy, into Latin, and it means literally to bury. So to be of a culture is to bury a seed and grow it, and to bury one's dead and venerate them. And both those senses of the word still coexist with us. One is the sense of looking forward to cyclical renewal, and the other is the looking back to the authority of the dead. This was me thinking through those words to try and understand what I thought about culture and what I understood about the myth as a way in which we are told stories which somehow foreclose our ability to understand them as made up. Or even if we understand them to be made up, we understand them to reflect a truth which is intergenerational and can't be changed. And at that level, that's where culture in terms of what we inherit and culture in terms of what we understand it as the arts operate on the two extremes of, if you like, opening out new possibilities or foreclosing the possibility to think differently about the way one lives. So yeah, and just a diagram to kind of try and understand that for myself, that culture is a thing which exists within nature and is centered on myths which explain the belief in the supernatural through reference to the natural world. And by making those stories which work back through nature to the supernatural, claim the authority that one's stories come from a realm beyond nature. the authority of the invisible, be it the High Father or the God or the creature, who is the creator, that element which is not part of culture, not part of nature, and gives those in control of the stories the power to dominate. So culture is also about opening up and about domination. Now, I'll just pop through these last few diagrams, which, if you like, understanding that in one culture, that system works just fine. When one has a number of cultures whose mythology differs and whose reality competes for the same material goods, that's where the division between in-group and out-group comes about. That those who are competing with us and believe something different are wrong, because it's not just that they want the same stuff as us, they've got the wrong relationship to the supernatural, to the cultural, to if you like, the core of being. And at that level, the contestation between cultures becomes justified always by the existence of somebody who's not even part of nature, somebody, an elder, who is so old as to have existed before nature. Now that's contestation between cultures. And ironically, if we go back to those early images about how society becomes more complex, we have, one could have more circles if you like, but with the contestation with culture, as culture has become more complicated, has become like, is that within our own culture, we have three very different kinds of culture. We have the scientific culture. We have culture as an industry, which we understand as the art world presentation. And we have culture, and I tie into that politics. And those three represent very different ways of understanding the world, which in traditional mythologies are unified into a single set of narratives which explain everything, but have come to pull apart into three different ways of pursuing understanding or truth. It relies on proof and ultimately on disbelief, on the idea that one might, that one makes a theory and tests it to see if it works. Representation, if you like, the way we think about and show the world, our art worlds are different, but increasingly the same. And the world of religion and politics are ultimately realms of belief, where things too complex to understand are taken on trust. And if you like, that putting together those two images, that we have both competition within our cultures and between our cultures, that generates a level of complexity that is extraordinary. None of our cultures, traditional cultures, can tend to deal with it. Within those ways of knowing, the scientific culture has expanded and become, if you like, so universalized as to become indistinguishable from nature, right? We don't know everything, but science is the same wherever you are. The theories work everywhere within the known universe, except at the very smallest scale of the atom, where they're not quite sure yet whether it's strings or waves or quarks or whatever. So culture, the things we now understand as culture are the world of representation, the world of belief. The world of knowledge or of science is understood to be outside of culture, and hence the man from Boko Haram, where science and technology are, if you like, now part of nature. They're not things that we think about. Now, This is probably the last slide, as we've developed into a level of global interaction, global complexity, turns out that our modes of representation, our art worlds, have become increasingly similar. Our TV shows have become increasingly similar. Our cultural output, if you like, is distinct, but far less distinct than it might have ever been before. And so representation has become a field of extreme contestation. If we think of the Roads Must Fall movement, that what was attacked there is a representation of a past idea, and an idea an idea, if you like, which is that an object which represents a past age and a past set of injustices also represents those injustices now. And the way that we start changing those injustices by competing on who is allowed to represent what and how. And if you like, the argument about cultural appropriation works in this space as well. The idea that I'm allowed to make art of a certain sort, and you're allowed to make art of a certain sort, and you can't make art like mine, and I can't make art like yours, because we're different. And that's an alarming, if you like, way of thinking about the world, that the tools by which we have explained our differences in ways that we can mutually engage with have dissolved into ultimately the last remaining and indissoluble aspect of culture, which is belief, be it religious belief or political belief, because that's the one realm in which, because it can't be proven or disproven, because it's in the realm of belief, it remains resistant to, if you like, integration or dissolution, one a positive, one a negative term, into a bigger culture. And, you know, that's, I guess we could use Trump as an example, that the refusal to take, to get a vaccine is tied into one's political beliefs and one's attendance of a particular kind of church, where one gloms onto what is resistant, or what one believes to be one's culture, to resist incorporation into a bigger and wider world. So that's where we're going to stop. It's that first slide pointed out that, what is it? The pessimist or the optimist believes that we live in the best possible of worlds, and the pessimist fears that that's correct. So I'll stop sharing at that point.
Huge thanks, Kevin. That was amazing to traverse from, you know, Haida to anti-vaxxers to my Sunday at Scarborough to the to religion, politics. Brilliant.